History remembers Gettysburg, Stalingrad, and D-Day, but what about the battles that killed hundreds of thousands yet barely earn a passing mention? From cities starved into cannibalism to armies erased in a single command, these are the wars history tried to bury. Hidden in dusty archives and uncomfortable truths, they are the forgotten sieges and battles with the highest death tolls, and their stories will shock you. At number 10, we begin with the Battle of Cartagena de Indias. In the spring of 1741, the British Empire embarked on what they believed would be the crowning jewel of their imperial expansion, the assault on Cartagena de Indias, a Spanish stronghold in present-day Colombia. Boasting an unprecedented fleet of 186 ships and nearly 30,000 soldiers and sailors, it was the largest expedition Britain had ever launched at that time. The Spanish defenders, led by the legendary Admiral Blas de Lezo, were hopelessly outnumbered with just 3,000 to 4,000 regulars and local militia. Initially, the British advanced with ease, securing smaller fortifications and believing victory was only days away. Yet as they closed in on the imposing Fort San Lázaro, their confidence turned to despair. The real enemy was not the Spanish cannons, but disease, especially yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery. With limited medical knowledge and appalling sanitation, the tropical climate tore through the British ranks like wildfire, with some regiments experiencing casualty rates as high as 90%. When the British attempted a desperate night assault on San Lázaro, they were met with fierce resistance, suffering devastating losses before retreating in chaos. By the campaign's end, over 9,500 men were dead, with the vast majority falling to sickness rather than combat. The humiliation was so great that Britain quietly erased the disaster from its official memory. Today, the Battle of Cartagena de Indias stands as a sobering reminder of how disease could annihilate the mightiest armies, proving that even the most powerful empire of the 18th century could be humbled by an invisible foe. Coming in at number 9, the Siege of Candia. Few events in military history can rival the sheer length and endurance of the Siege of Candia, which unfolded over an astonishing 21 years on the island of Crete. Beginning in 1648, the mighty Ottoman Empire laid siege to the Venetian fortress city of Candia, determined to capture the last Venetian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans opened their campaign with more than 60,000 troops, subjecting the fortress to relentless artillery bombardments for years on end. The Venetians, heavily outnumbered, nevertheless resisted with remarkable resilience, bolstered by reinforcements from France and other European allies who feared unchecked Ottoman expansion. For 16 years, the walls of Candia absorbed cannon fire, yet they stood defiant, forcing the Ottomans into a grinding war of attrition. The defenders endured not only bombardments, but also starvation, disease, and endless trench warfare. The turning point came in 1669, when a catastrophic accident, an explosion on a French warship anchored in the harbor, crippled morale and weakened the garrison's ability to resist. With limited supplies and no hope of relief, the Venetians finally surrendered after 2 decades of unimaginable suffering. The casualty count was staggering, estimated at nearly 150,000 combined losses across both sides. For the Ottomans, victory came at a price so immense it bled their empire of men and resources, accelerating their decline in the centuries that followed. Despite its epic scale and human cost, the Siege of Candia has faded from popular memory, overshadowed by faster and more decisive wars, yet it remains the longest recorded siege in human history. At number 8, the Battle of Kolubara. While the world focused on the blood-soaked trenches of France and Belgium during the opening months of World War I, a smaller yet equally brutal struggle unfolded in the Balkans, the Battle of Kolubara. This campaign, fought in late 1914, pitted the Kingdom of Serbia against the Austro-Hungarian Empire in a desperate contest for survival. Serbia, already battered by the Balkan Wars, faced shortages of weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and even food. Its exhausted army appeared on the verge of collapse as Austria-Hungary launched its third invasion, forcing Serbian troops into a hasty retreat and abandonment of their capital, Belgrade. To Vienna, it seemed the war in the Balkans was won. Yet, in the face of overwhelming odds, a new Serbian commander, Marshal Živojin Mišić, reorganized his demoralized army and prepared a daring counteroffensive. On November 16, 1914, Serbian forces struck with ferocious determination, catching the Austro-Hungarians off guard. Over the following weeks, the Serbs pushed their enemies back, recapturing Belgrade and liberating their homeland in one of the most stunning reversals of the early war. However, victory came at a staggering price. Casualties for both sides soared beyond 405,000 men, 132,000 Serbian dead and wounded, alongside nearly 273,000 Austro-Hungarian losses. For a nation as small as Serbia, this was a near existential sacrifice, but it became a cornerstone of their national pride and identity. Despite its epic scale, the Battle of Kolubara remains a footnote in the broader narrative of World War I, yet it is a testament to the endurance and spirit of a small nation that refused to be erased. From history. At number 7, the Battle of Galicia. When most people think of World War I, they picture the stagnant trench lines of the Western Front, but the Eastern Front was an entirely different battlefield, vast, mobile, and equally catastrophic. The Battle of Galicia in 1914 stands as one of the earliest and bloodiest campaigns of the war, pitting the Russian Empire against Austria-Hungary in a desperate contest for dominance in Central Europe. Beginning in late August and lasting until early September, this clash was not a single engagement, but rather a series of immense operations across hundreds of miles. Millions of soldiers were deployed, and the fighting quickly escalated into a campaign of colossal proportions. The Russian army, advancing with momentum, pressed deep into Galicia, inflicting devastating defeats on the Austro-Hungarian forces. Towns and villages were consumed by fire, fields littered with corpses, and supply lines crumbled under the strain of constant movement. Although the Russians ultimately forced their enemy into retreat, their triumph was Pyrrhic. 225,000 of their soldiers lay dead, wounded, or missing. For Austria-Hungary, the disaster was even greater, with 324,000 men lost and their army's morale shattered. By the time the battle ended, the combined casualties had soared to over 655,000 in just a matter of weeks, making it one of the earliest, bloodiest campaigns of the Great War. Yet, despite its enormous scale, the Battle of Galicia is rarely remembered outside of specialist circles. The Western Front dominates popular memory with its iconic imagery of trenches and barbed wire, while the brutal maneuver warfare of the East has faded into obscurity. The forgotten carnage of Galicia serves as a grim reminder of how World War I was truly global in its devastation, and how entire nations bled into the soil far beyond Flanders and the Somme. At number 6, the Siege of Tenochtitlan. The fall of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the mighty Aztec Empire, is often remembered as a dramatic story of European conquistadors toppling a civilization against impossible odds. Yet the truth of the siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 is far darker and far more tragic. Led by Hernán Cortés, a force of only a few hundred Spanish soldiers, bolstered by tens of thousands of native allies resentful of Aztec domination, laid siege to the jewel of Mesoamerica. For 3 grueling months, the defenders resisted ferociously, fighting to protect their temples, homes, and way of life. But even before the Spanish arrived at the city gates, an invisible killer was already at work: smallpox. Introduced by a single infected Spaniard, the epidemic swept mercilessly through the Aztec population, striking down warriors, leaders, and civilians alike. The disease claimed perhaps half of the city's inhabitants before the final battle began, leaving bodies piled in streets and homes abandoned in grief. When the siege tightened, starvation and thirst added to the torment as the Spaniards cut off the city's aqueducts and blockaded supplies. Eventually, resistance collapsed under the triple blow of famine, plague, and war. By the time Cortés claimed victory, an estimated 100,000 to 240,000 people had perished. What was portrayed as a Spanish military triumph was, in reality, a catastrophic biological disaster. The conquest of Tenochtitlan was less about steel and gunpowder and more about disease that decimated an empire before a decisive sword was struck. Yet popular retellings often sanitize this grim truth, celebrating European conquest while overlooking the genocide brought by microbes. The siege remains one of the most devastating collapses in recorded history, where a mighty civilization was undone not only by invading armies, but by an unseen enemy carried unknowingly across the ocean. At number 5, the Gorlice-Tarnów Offensive. By 1915, the Eastern Front of World War I had settled into a draining stalemate, with the Russian Empire pressing hard against Austro-Hungarian defenses and threatening to spill into Hungary. But in May of that year, the Central Powers unleashed one of the most devastating offensives of the war, the Gorlice-Tarnów Offensive. A combined German and Austro-Hungarian force was secretly massed in Galicia, employing night marches and elaborate feints to mask their intentions. At dawn on May 2nd, the offensive began with an artillery barrage of unprecedented ferocity. More than 300,000 shells rained down in a single day, delivered with a staggering 5-to-1 superiority in guns. The Russian lines disintegrated under the bombardment, trenches obliterated, and soldiers cut down before they could mount any defense. Once the artillery lifted, the infantry surged forward, carving through the shattered Russian positions. Panic spread, and what followed was a 300-mile retreat, with the Russian army collapsing in disarray. In just a few weeks, the Central Powers reclaimed vast swaths of territory, including the fortress of Przemyśl, and drove Russian forces entirely out of Poland. The victory was decisive, but the human toll was catastrophic. Russia alone suffered over 1 million casualties, including nearly 1 million prisoners, a staggering loss that crippled its ability to sustain the war effort. For the Austro-Hungarians and Germans, it was perhaps their greatest single triumph of the war, but it came at the cost of staggering bloodshed. Yet despite its scale, the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive has been largely forgotten in popular histories. One reason is that the empires involved, the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian, did not survive the war, leaving no lasting national narrative to memorialize the battle. Overshadowed by the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele, Gorlice-Tarnów remains a ghost in the annals of history, a brutal campaign that demonstrated both the destructive power of modern artillery and the fragility of empires on the edge of collapse. At number 4, the Siege of Suiyang. The Siege of Suiyang, fought during the devastating An Lushan Rebellion in 8th century China, stands as one of the most horrifying examples of human endurance pushed beyond the limits of morality. With the Tang dynasty under threat, the small city of Suiyang found itself encircled by a rebel force 5 times its size. Commander Zhang Sun, with just 6,800 loyal soldiers, became the embodiment of defiance. For months, the defenders resisted wave after wave of assaults, inflicting brutal losses on the attackers through ingenious tactics and unyielding courage. Night after night, drums thundered from the ramparts, keeping the rebels in constant fear of ambushes. Yet courage alone could not feed the starving garrison. Supplies dwindled, animals and vegetation were consumed, and famine tightened its grip. What followed became one of the darkest chapters in siege warfare: systematic cannibalism. Contemporary records describe how Zhang Sun sacrificed his concubine to feed his soldiers, declaring, "I cannot cut my own flesh, but I will not spare her while my men starve." In an agonizing descent into desperation, the population of the city turned to human flesh as their only means of survival. Despite the unimaginable suffering, Suiyang held out for months longer, delaying the rebels and buying precious time for the Tang loyalists elsewhere. When the city finally fell, between 160,000 and 200,000 lives had been extinguished. Unlike other celebrated tales of heroic last stands, the siege of Suiyang is shrouded in uneasy silence, its legacy tainted by the moral horror of cannibalism. Yet it remains a haunting reminder of the extremes to which human beings will go when survival and loyalty collide under the crushing weight of war. At number 3, the Siege of Gurgan. When the Mongols marched westward in the early 13th century, few dared to resist their terrifying advance. The city of Gurgan, one of the jewels of the Khwarezmian Empire, made the fateful decision to defy them and paid with near total annihilation. Led by Genghis Khan's most brilliant generals, Jibei and Subutai, the Mongols stormed the city after a swift and brutal campaign. But the true horror began not with the battle, but with the systematic extermination that followed. Genghis Khan, intent on making an example of Gurgan, ordered the city's entire population put to death. For 40 days, Mongol soldiers slaughtered men, women, and children in numbers so vast that chroniclers could only compare it to harvesting a field. The massacre was carried out with chilling organization, designed to terrorize all who heard of it. Some sources estimate the death toll at 90,000. Others, in a grim exaggeration of scale, suggest it may have reached as high as 1.2 million. Whatever the true figure, the destruction of Gurgan was one of the most ruthless acts of mass killing in medieval history. When the Mongols finally tired of the slaughter, they looted the city until nothing remained but ashes. The fall of Gurgan was not merely a military conquest, it was a psychological weapon, spreading fear ahead of Mongol armies like wildfire. Cities that learned of its fate often surrendered without resistance, choosing subjugation over annihilation. Today, the siege of Gurgan is rarely mentioned in detail, often absorbed into the broader narrative of Mongol expansion. Yet, it deserves recognition as one of history's most chilling episodes of deliberate extermination, where terror itself was wielded as the deadliest weapon of war. At number 2, the Siege of Baghdad. In the mid-13th century, Baghdad stood as the shining center of the Islamic Golden Age, a city of learning, science, wealth, and culture, revered as the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate. But in 1258, that jewel was shattered by the unstoppable force of the Mongols under Hulagu Khan. Caliph al-Mustasim, arrogant and disastrously complacent, ignored warnings and left his city unprepared. When the Mongol army arrived, the defenses quickly crumbled. The siege itself lasted little more than a week, but what followed was one of the darkest catastrophes in recorded history. For 7 days, Baghdad became a slaughterhouse. Men, women, and children were massacred in staggering numbers, with chroniclers estimating anywhere from 200,000 to nearly 2 million dead. Beyond the human toll, the cultural destruction was incalculable. The legendary House of Wisdom, home to priceless manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, was ransacked. Countless books were flung into the Tigris River until, as witnesses claimed, its waters ran black with ink. Knowledge painstakingly accumulated over centuries was wiped away in a matter of days, setting back entire fields of science and learning. The Mongols showed no mercy, executing the caliph by rolling him in a carpet and trampling him to death, a symbolic act of final humiliation. The fall of Baghdad not only ended the Abbasid Caliphate, but also marked the collapse of a cultural era that had illuminated the medieval world. Despite its monumental significance, the siege of Baghdad is often compressed into a footnote in Mongol history. Yet, the sack of Baghdad was more than a conquest. It was a civilizational tragedy, where both human lives and human knowledge were obliterated in one of history's darkest weeks. Finally, at number 1, the Battle of Changping. Long before the wars of Rome or the Mongol conquests, ancient China witnessed a battle so vast and so brutal that it may rank as the deadliest single clash in human history. Between 262 and 260 BC, the rival states of Qin and Zhou fought for dominance in the decisive Battle of Changping. At first, the conflict dragged on in stalemate, with both sides reluctant to gamble everything. But Qin's commander, the brilliant and ruthless general Bai Qi, changed the tide through cunning deception. He spread misinformation that led Zhou to replace its cautious general with a reckless one. With the enemy commander outmaneuvered, Bai Qi lured the Zhou army of 450,000 men into a deadly trap. Encircled and cut off from supplies, the Zhou soldiers endured a brutal 46-day siege, their desperation mounting as starvation gnawed at them. Finally, they surrendered, believing mercy might spare their lives, but Bai Qi had no intention of clemency. In one of the most chilling acts of calculated mass execution, he ordered the burial alive of roughly 400,000 captured soldiers. Only a few thousand young men were spared to spread word of the Qin's terrifying might. The death toll of Changping exceeded 650,000, permanently crippling the state of Zhou and paving the way for Qin's eventual unification of China. This was not merely a battle, but a deliberate act of annihilation, a grim precursor to total warfare centuries before the concept even existed. Despite its staggering scale, the Battle of Changping is scarcely remembered outside of Chinese historical scholarship, yet it deserves recognition as perhaps the single bloodiest battle in the ancient world, a haunting reminder of the extremes of power, fear, and ambition. The forgotten battles we've uncovered remind us that the deadliest forces in war are often not swords or cannons, but famine, disease, and ruthless strategies of annihilation. From Tenochtitlan's plague-ridden streets to Suiyang's desperate cannibalism, these events reveal the brutal lengths humanity has endured and chosen to survive. History may try to erase these tragedies, but remembering them gives us a fuller, sobering picture of the true cost of war. If you found this journey into history's darkest corners insightful, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful stories from the past. Thanks for watching.